Profession by Isaac Asimov, beginning at the gap on page 44. During the short skimmer hop, Inginescu kept up an even flow of small talk, pointing out the landmarks of the city, reminiscing about past Olympics he had seen. George, who paid just enough attention to make vague sounds during the pauses, watched the route of flight anxiously. Would they head for one of the shield openings and leave the city altogether? The skimmer landed at the roof entry of a hotel, and, as he alighted, Inginescu said, "I hope you'll eat dinner with me in my room." George said, "Yes," and grinned unaffectedly. He was just beginning to realize the gap left within him by a missing lunch. Inginescu let George eat in silence. Night closed in, and the wall lights went on automatically. George thought, "I've been on my own for almost 24 hours. And then, over the coffee, Inginescu finally spoke again. He said, "You've been acting as though you think I intend you harm." George reddened and put down his cup and tried to deny it, but the older man laughed and shook his head. "It's so. I've been watching you closely since I first saw you, and I think I know a great deal about you now." George rose, half in horror. Inginescu said, "But sit down. I only want to help you." George sat down, but his thoughts were in a whirl. If the old man knew who he was, why had he not left him to the policeman? On the other hand, why should he volunteer help? Inginescu said, "You want to know why I should want to help you? Oh, don't look alarmed. I can't read minds. It's just that my training enables me to judge the little reactions that gives minds away, you see. Do you understand that?" George shook his head. Inginescu said, "Consider my first sight of you. You were waiting in line to watch the Olympics, and your micro-reactions didn't match what you were doing. The expression of your face was wrong. The action of your hands was wrong. It meant that something in general was wrong. And the interesting thing was that whatever it was nothing common, nothing obvious. Perhaps I thought it was something of which your own conscious mind was unaware. I couldn't help but follow you, sit next to you. I followed you again when you left and eavesdropped on the conversation between your friend and yourself. After that, you were far too interesting an object of study. I'm sorry if that sounds cold-blooded, for me to allow you to be taken off by a policeman. Now tell me, what is it that troubles you?" George was in agony of indecision. If this was a trap, why should it be such an indirect, roundabout one? And he had to turn to someone. He had come to the city to find help, and here was help being offered. Perhaps what was wrong was that it was being offered, and it came too easy. Inginescu said, "Of course, what you tell me as a social scientist is a privileged communication. Do you know what that means?" "No, sir." "It means it would be dishonorable for me to repeat what you say to anyone for any purpose. Moreover, no one has the legal right to compel me to repeat it." George said with sudden suspicion, "I thought you were a historian." "So I am." "Just now you said you were a social scientist." Inginescu broke into loud laughter and apologized for it when he could talk. I'm sorry, young man. I shouldn't laugh, and I wasn't really laughing at you. I was laughing at Earth and its emphasis on physical science, and the practical segments of it at that. I'll bet you can rattle off every subdivision of construction technology or mechanical engineering, and yet you're a blank on social science." "Well, then what is social science?" "Social science studies groups of human beings, and there are many high specialized branches to it, just as there are to zoology, for instance. For instance, there are culturists who study the mechanics of cultures, their growth, development, and decay. Cultures," he added, forestalling a question, "are all the aspects of a way of life. For instance, it includes the way we make our living, the things we enjoy and believe, and what we consider good and bad, and so on. Do you understand?" "I think I do." As an economist, not an economic statistician now, but an economist, specializes in the study of the way culture supplies the bodily needs to its individual members. A psychologist specializes in the individual member of society and how he is affected by the society. A futurist specializes in planning the future course of society. And a historian, that's where I come in now. Yes, sir. A historian specializes in the past development of our own society and the societies with other cultures. George found himself interested. Was it different in the past? I should say it was. Until 1,000 years ago, there was no education, not what we call education, at least. George said, I know. People learned in bits and pieces out of books. Why, how do you know that? Why, how do you know this? I've heard about it, said George cautiously. Then, is there any use in worrying about what happened long ago? I mean, it's done with, isn't it? It's never done with, my boy. The past explains the present. For instance, why is our educational system what it is? George stirred restlessly. The man kept bringing the subject back to that. He said snappishly, because it's best. Ah, but why is it best? Now you listen to me for one moment and I'll explain. Then you can tell me if there is any use in history. Even before interstellar travel was developed, he broke off and looked at the look of complete astonishment on George's face. Well, did you think we always had it? I never gave it a thought, sir. I'm sure you didn't, but there was a time, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, when mankind was confined to the surface of Earth. Even then, his culture had grown quite technological, and his numbers had increased to the point where any failure in technology would have meant mass starvation and disease. To maintain the technological level and advance it in the face of an increasing population, more and more technicians and scientists had to be trained, and yet, as science advanced, it took longer and longer to train them. As first interplanetary and then interstellar travel was developed, the problem grew more acute. In fact, actual colonization of extrasolar planets was impossible for about 1,500 years because of lack of properly trained men. The turning point came when our mechanics of the storage of knowledge within our brain was worked out. Once that had been done, it became possible to devise educational tapes that would modify the mechanics in such a way that it placed within the mind a body of knowledge ready-made, so to speak. But you know all about that. Once that was done, trained men could be turned out by the thousands and millions, and we could begin what someone has since called the filling of the universe. There are now 1,500 inhabited planets in the galaxy, and there is no end in sight. Do you see all that is involved? Earth exports education tapes for low specialized professions, and that keeps the galactic culture unified. For instance, the reading tapes ensure that a single language for all of us. Don't look so surprised. Other languages are possible, and in the past were used, hundreds of them. Earth also exports high specialized professionals and keeps its own population at an endurable level. Since they are shipped out in a balanced sex ratio, they act as self-reproductive units and help increase the populations on the outworlds where the increase is needed. Furthermore, tapes and men are paid for in material, which we much need and on which our economy depends. Now, do you understand why our education is the best way? Yes, sir. Does it help you to understand knowing that without it, interstellar colonization was impossible for 1,500 years? Yes, sir. Then you see the uses of history, the historian smiled. And now I wonder if you see why I'm interested in you. George snapped out of time and back into reality. Inginescu apparently didn't talk aimlessly. All this lecture had been a device to attack him from a new angle. He said once again withdrawn, hesitating, "Why? Social scientists work with societies, and societies are made up of people." All right, but people aren't machines. The professionals in physical science work with machines. There's only a limited amount to know about a machine, and the professionals know it all. Furthermore, all machines of a given sort are just alike, so that there is nothing to interest them in any given individual machine. But people, they are so complex and so different from one another that a social scientist never knows all there is to know, or even a good part of what there is to know. To understand his own specialty, he must always be ready to study people, particularly unusual specimens. Like me, George said tonelessly. I shouldn't call you a specimen, I suppose, but you are unusual. You're worth studying. And if you will allow me that privilege, then, in return, I will help you if you are in trouble, and if I can. There were pinwheels whirring in George's mind. All this talk about people and colonization made possible by education. It was as though caked through within him were being broken up and strewn about mercilessly. He said, "Let me think," and clamped his hands over his ears. He took them away and he said to the historian, "Will you do something for me, sir?" "If I can," said the historian amiably. "And everything I say in this room is privileged communication. You said so, and I meant it. Then get me an interview with an outworld official, with a Novian." Inginescu looked startled. "Well, now, you can do it," said George earnestly. "You're an important official. I saw the policeman's look when you put that card in front of his eyes. If you refuse, I won't let you study me." It sounded silly, like a silly threat in George's own ears, one without force. On Inginescu, however, it seemed to have a strong effect. He said, "That's an impossible condition. A Novian in Olympics month." "All right, then. Get me a Novian on the phone, and I'll make my own arrangements for an interview." "Do you think you can?" "I know I can. Wait and see." Inginescu stared at George thoughtfully, and then reached for the visiphone. George waited, half drunk with his new outlook on the whole problem and the sense of power it brought. It couldn't miss. It couldn't miss. He would be a Novian yet. He would leave Earth in triumph, despite Antonelli and the whole crew of fools at the house for the, he almost laughed aloud, feeble-minded. Stopping at the gap on page 49.